Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight at Chelsea and also online for this invited lecture by fellow researchers from OCAD University, Ontario College of Art and Design. So I am Maria Katsichristodoulou. My role here is Dean of Research and Knowledge Exchange for Chelsea, Camberwell and Wimbledon colleges. And so I support research and the work we do with communities and with businesses. And I also work with colleagues to develop strategic partnerships. And OCAD is one of our strategic partners in Canada. It is a leading institution in art and design, education and research, as is University of the Arts London. And the relationship with OCAD has been ongoing for a number of years now, so as I understand 6 or 7 years, working on student exchange and working through some of our courses. And what we have wanted to achieve is to develop a more holistic partnership and to take advantage of the fact that we have common research interests and expertise, a very similar ethos around things such as equitable partnerships, using practice as research to think and make and act on the big challenges of today, such as issues around inclusive design, around health, and around climate crisis. So I met Ashok when we were visiting OCAD last year with the provost for Chelsea, Camberwell and Wimbledon and some of our team. And Paul will soon introduce the colleagues who have visited. But it felt really appropriate for us to look at how we can work together in other areas and how we can amplify the impact of our work through collaborating on research as well as learning and teaching. So we're very, very pleased to have you here. Thank you so much for coming all the way. And also thank you to Paul and the TrAIN Research Centre for hosting this event and also for actually leading on developing this research partnership that hopefully will lead to many more visits and exchanges. So thank you, and then pass on to you, Paul.
Thank you, Maria. Okay, so I'm Paul Goodwin. Maria said I'm Director of TrAIN, the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation. And it's a real pleasure to welcome artists and researchers Dr. Ashok Mathur and Dr. Ayumi Goto to speak to us tonight for this special TrAIN opening lecture. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I wanted to say a few words about TrAIN, especially for those of you who are joining TrAIN online for the first time and those of you here who may not be as familiar with what we do. TrAIN is a community of researchers based at UAL and at CCW's, Chelsea, Camberwell and Wimbledon Colleges of Art. In our work, we try to challenge dominant top-down notions of globalization and try to open up and create new visions of a more plural and worlded art and design history. TrAIN's membership includes curators, art historians and design historians, artists and theorists from across many disciplines at UAL. And we also have a thriving community, a really strong community of PhD research students and associate researchers. If you want to find out more about TrAIN and what we do and for future events, please check us on the UAL main website, search on the TrAIN Research Centres. And the website's under construction at the moment, but will be updated shortly. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our special guests from OCAD Toronto, Dr. Ashok Mathur and Dr. Ayumi Goto. They'll be delivering a 2-part lecture tonight as part of their residency at Chelsea, inaugurating an ongoing faculty exchange between the two universities Maria has just mentioned. Dr. Mathur will go first and will deliver a talk addressing cultural knowledge and its operations through love, trauma and violence, focusing on recuperative measures that might allow for transformational intergenerational knowledge. Dr. Goto will deliver a talk and a performance, which we're really looking forward to, on not belonging, an investigation of diasporic practice and a refutation of the externally imposed insistence that we all need to find a place, nation or community, to belong. What do we share across spaces of not belonging? I think it's a very apt question that we're facing at this particular time, both here in the UK and internationally, with genocides being committed in Palestine. Both papers will be published as separate monographs as part of the Perin Panthaky International Lecture Series, which we are collaborating with tonight. A little bit about the Perin Panthaky Lecture Series. The Perin Panthaky International Lecture Series is dedicated to promoting critical insights on creativity and social practice. Ashok Mathur, née Panthaky, was a dynamic thinker, artist, nurse, and advocate for equity. As an immigrant to Canada, born to Parsi, Zarathustrian parents in India, she was a lifelong supporter for the rights of girls and women and others who were disenfranchised from participating fully in their original or adopted homelands. The lecture and publication series will transform international scholarship into unique published monographs as a permanent record of creative enterprise and strategic development in the areas of social engagement, and we're very happy to collaborate with this particular event. Just a little bit about Ashok and Ayumi. Ashok is Vice President and Research Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at Ontario College of Art and Design, OCAD, in Toronto. He's a South Asian cultural organizer, a writer, and visual artist. Previously, he held the Canada Research Chair in Cultural and Artistic Inquiry, and he also directed the Centre for Innovation in Culture and the Arts in Canada. Ayumi is a performance apprentice based in Toronto, in the traditional territories of the, and I try to practice these names, and forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron, Wendow, Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. I'm sorry for destroying those names. As diasporic Japanese, she at times draws upon her cultural heritage and language to creatively reconsider sentiments surrounding national culturalism, migrations, activist strategies, and land human relations. She's also currently a postdoctoral fellow at OCAD in Toronto. I'd like to thank Tim Nadoni, Melanie Robinson, and Mary Ashcroft to help to organise this event. So our speakers will speak one after each other, and then we will open it up to the audience in the room and online, also online, for questions after they've both spoken. For those online who want to ask questions, please use the Q&A box in the chat, and then we'll read them out, okay? So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ashok Mathur.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I feel like I'm at the Oscars because I have all these thank yous to make, but before I do that, I want to make a couple of notes. I realized, I was saying to Ayumi today, that it's 25 years ago, almost to the day, that I last came to the UK to do a residence, and I had just accepted an offer at Emily Carr University, but I told them I can't come there right away because I have to come here and do a residence. It was up north. I was working at University of York in a writing residency, and I was a teaching residency. I say this because, and thank you, Paul, for reading out the traditional territorial acknowledgements, which has become de rigueur in Canada to do. It wasn't always that way. And 25 years ago, it wasn't that way. And when I was here at the University of York, one thing I recognized, I was talking to Ayumi about this the other day, was that there's this wealth of human and non-human history in a place like this. When I was there at York, I was in a residence that was about an hour walk away from the university, and I looked up the history of it, and I realized that underneath this residence, this city of York, Norse Viking space, was a burial ground. And on top of that burial ground was a Roman burial ground, right? So there's all these histories and layers and archaeological layers. And it's very different than what we have in a Canadian context. And when I come to a new place, I want to be able to understand that and acknowledge it because it's so easy to take, as diaspora people, to take what you are from to the new place and insist on that homeness. and it's good to be displaced, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. I was working at York as well as on my second novel, and it was actually based on some of the history of my mother, Perin Panthaky, which is originating the series. And I do want to say that we will do a publication series from this. In a month's time, Professor Emily Men, who's a Canada Research Chair, will also be visiting here. He'll be here for another 2 weeks. And I'm very pleased to be able to host Kamathi, who's going to be coming out. Kamathi Dr will be coming out, Dr. Dr, to Toronto in May of next year. So it's very, very lush and very, very rich, and thank you for that, Maria. The people to thank here are Charlotte, Wendy Short, Wendy Anderson, Tim, Maria, Paul, Kamathi, Shintaro, Angelica. They're the two MA students who helped install the show, which is over in D Block, and I'm going to end this presentation by talking a bit about that exhibition, a photo exhibition there. Mary and Melanie for helping out today, and of course all of you for attending. So I'm going to launch right into this talk. It's kind of in two parts as well, so I'll be doing two parts. What I'm going to do is do a little bit of reading from something I've been reflecting on in terms of the trauma, notions of trauma and love. And then I'm going to move to talk about the exhibition, which I think you'll see has a parallel to it. So I'm going to start then with this. And the initial take on this was I was responding to Ayumi. She had written this very interesting, or she is writing this very interesting project called Letters to Future Love. And it was a beautiful project and concept, beautiful work. And I started to think about that, and I started to think about the notion of letters. Letters... The words in and of themselves are both micro and macro. It can mean any one of 26 vowels and consonants in the Romanic alphabet. It can also mean a collection of any number of single ciphers into words and phrases and sentences and paragraphs and pages, composed from an author with an intended sole or multiple audience in mind. It also brings to that same mind not so much the Romanic, but the Romantic tradition of a epistle sent to one's heart's desire. The act of such a letter is not complete without the final pen stroke and wax seal, but with the recipient reading the longhand script, breathless intake of words of unencumbered love. Of course, it could also be prepositionally situated articles, a letter of interest, of protest, of complaint, dealing this morning with a letter of complaint about me back at my home university. These are usually typed, and so the cursive swirl of emotion is not contained in the script. The point here is that letters reach out. They are beyond themselves, not because of the intrinsic knowledge of some mystical quality they possess, but because they are relational. Their effects never complete, and arguably never started until they are received, interpreted, and understood in ways that might confuse or even disturb the original sender. But the letters do land, they take root, and they move forward. We can perhaps learn from letters that our entire existence is relational. Even the solipsists among us have to contend with hearing themselves in the void. We become not by being isolated, but by being in concert. This is a story of resilience and accountability, and how reaching out to and with may be the only purchase we have on surviving the world around us, one that has created us as much as we have created it. So picture this as a start. Since the beginning of film, as a species, we have become entranced by the monstrous, the grotesque, and the macabre. The fantastical inhabit our dreams and our nightmares. We imagine as far as we can, and then we imagine further. What ifs fill our minds and pose in bas-relief to the mundanity of our daily lives. It is as if our minds seek to escape our corporeal existence, a make-believe world that takes our spirits into orbit while our feet walk the earth. I remember the first time I saw monsters in film. They were King Kong, and they were dinosaurs, stop-motion animated to appear as titans. And there was Jaws, whose terror was partly informed by invisibility and human frailty. And then there was Godzilla, a response to and construction of a nuclear age, forcing penance on humans for their misbegotten destructive principles, Godzilla who stomped on everything from Tokyo to Bambi, Godzilla who exhaled radioactive storms, Godzilla who rampaged apparently without purpose or intent, but who made it clear humankind was considered the vilest and therefore the most appropriate of targets. Godzilla represented all that is worst about us, but by performing a cleansing ritual and then himself cleansed right out of existence to witness human triumph, he gave us hope. The atomic bombs that devastated first Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, were the seeds for the script that birthed Godzilla, a product both of atomic energy and human arrogance, a loss of face and a loss of honor. Picture next a scene of domesticity, a young family making its way as immigrants and farmers in a land distant from birthright. The father drinks too much and has a propensity for violence. His wife and daughters develop strategies to keep the peace, keep themselves and each other safe from the Godzilla-like rage that visits the father with unpredictable frequency. Yet they love this flawed man with every fiber of their being, and they seek and succor his favor when they can, and he in turn does love them back, if not demonstrably, then philosophically. But oh, when fists clench and boots stomp, how to read relational love in those dire times. His youngest, the Cordelia to his Lear, seeks desperately to understand, to fashion a practice that can still the violence and unleash the love. There is a story she will tell many years later about how after her father has succumbed to a hard life leading to an early death, a story about the final episode of violence that she can recall. He was angry, she would say, angrier than she had ever seen, and it wasn't long before fists were flying and the teenage girl could only hold up her forearms as mute resistance to the blows, a defensive boxing strategy that held little hope when met with the brute force of a much larger, angry, drunken man. She would tell the story of how in this rage and amidst the blows she found herself at the top of a staircase, losing her balance and then seeing her father come at her again, this time with kicks so harsh she plummeted halfway down the stairs to the landing. It was perhaps the worst beating she had experienced, and she could tell her father saw the same. So when he descended the stairs and approached her, she raised her hands toward him, thinking now, at last he can see how awful this is, and how he must, out of sheer humanity and father love, lift her up in those powerful arms and soothe her and tell her all would be all right. She raised her hands to feel his welcoming embrace and was not prepared when he took those 2-3 steps toward her, and instead of reaching out to her pleading arms, viciously kicked her through her limbs onto her chest. Her breath left her, and her eyes dimmed, and even so she could see the absolute terror that was her father's face. Another kick, and she slid down the remaining stairs, heaving to regain breath, the sweet taste of iron that comes from blood circling her tongue. Her father came down the last of those stairs and stood above her, fists clenching and unclenching involuntarily, as natural as breath. And she looked up and saw a halo of light and thought this was the end, and she began to laugh and laugh and laugh. Peals of laughter, guttural and loud, almost a screech, so powerful it stunned the father for a moment, just long enough to hear her spit out a question. Why don't you just kill me now? And then, because if you love me, you could not do what you are doing. There was a tableau of silence, but for beating hearts and hard breath, and then softly, sternly, suggestively, why don't you just kill me? The father wavered, took a slight step forward, and then a larger one back. He fell to his knees. He wept copiously into his hands. He wailed his regret and his pain and his sorrow, and he could hear his daughter's whimpered voice finally as she realized the violence had ended, not just for this time, but forever. This is clearly not my story, not even my story to tell. So why do I do this? Why do I permit myself to enter this realm of story that hurts and hinders humanity? It is an attempt, feeble perhaps, to understand Cordelia reaching out to her father in her time of absolute need, and Lear's incapacity to reach back. In his rage at being a failed parent, a poor farmer, an immigrant devastated by his nation's lost face in times of war, his own inadequacies that tore into him each day he was alive, it was impossible for him to reach out with loving embrace just when the world required him to do so. But it was also impossible for him to acquiesce to his daughter's plea to end her life. Because in that moment, finally, and with devastating effect, he could see not just what he had become, but what he had almost done to the most perfect creature in the universe. What smashing fists and stomping feet could not accomplish, his daughter's resilience and challenge and love prevailed. Her refusal to move beyond the relational, indeed to return to it when she felt it was her final breath, torpedoed the Godzilla in him. He could be that no more. When we lose sight of what we call humanity, when we give in to impulses of hatred and anger and violence and war, we do so not because we seek superiority, because we recognize our failures and refuse to abide by them. When we fail to see the other, we necessarily fail to see ourselves. And I lost my place, but when seem to have lost some pages here. I'm going to check to see if I've left them in my bag here. Hang on one second. It does indeed. But when we lean into the relational, the presence of the world beyond our skin, human and non-human, equally and strongly, we give ourselves respite. We are not just not alone, we are uncompromisingly affiliated, like mycenic tentacles under the earth, or molecular construction of our atmosphere. We are nothing but in relation to anything and everything outside of ourselves. And to elide the veils of Maya that hide all existence behind illusion, our only hope is to seek those relationships. And here is where I turn to creativity and performativity in its essence. When we create art, we seek connectivity. When our bodies are part and parcel of that creative impulse, we perform potentiality. And this is the start of what I am thinking of as an aesthetic of relationality that can and should be encompassed by a focus on the intentional acts of making art. If Godzilla was our bastard child, born of untold abuses of power, then looking deeply into the eyes of sentient beings is our salvation. And this can create a kindness and resilience that is so critical in this world as the center cannot hold. And if practiced well and widely, things do not need to fall apart, but can come together in ways that greatly surpass our construction of monsters within. This is also a tale of contrasts. Let's not call them binaristic for all the flaws that holds, but juxtapositions that can only be understood when the mind creates. When the mind, to sever itself from eternal pain, must create. This summer, Ayumi and I, we traveled to Okinawa for the third time. But this was substantially different than before. Was it, I wondered, the shades of age closing down, a recognition of my own imminent mortality, and thus a wish to seek a worldly change? Or was it again an aging body, mortal mind seeking refuge in emotional release? This is what becomes of ourselves when we have so many more years in the rearview mirror than we can hope for in the road ahead. We went to the Peace Memorial just outside of Naha, a site that features dozens of memorials dedicated to prefectures and other communities who had lost thousands upon thousands in a battle that lasted only 82 days. Each monument carefully thought through, tasteful, kind, honorific, multitudes of gardens, oversea views of seascapes, and a museum that told the hard story piece by piece. On this particular day, the site was overrun by middle school students, garbed in uniform and full of youthful energy, those in my age bracket can only hold as a distant memory. I walked alongside them through room after room, room of terror, me trembling, they giddily seeking out their friends and secret crushes. I wept openly at the memories that were not mine, but I inhabited nonetheless. I thought of Wordsworth and his contrite reflection on our human inhumanity. Through endless tears, I gazed on moving images of lives about to be lost or already gone, immolated in caverns or organs exploded by their own hand. I swooned and hit the ground, and yet I stayed standing still, immobile in my wretched existence that lived but could not prevent the past, which means I could not prevent the future. The Battle of Okinawa replays itself in our tomorrows because we forget the killing fields of our ancestors. And yet, the next day we drove further down the coast and dreamt of Yutaki, the spaces created by powerful women of the Ryukyu realm, where spirit meets earth. We found ourselves encamped in shipping containers, remarkably converted to beautiful suites with outdoor tubs and spanning views of the ocean. And we knew that in the caverns beneath us were the Yutaki of old. Yutas were women who held spirit, and because they did, like so many of the powerful souls before them, were outlawed, discriminated against, and forbidden to practice. For powerful women everywhere are so often brought to heal in a universe led by violence. Yet this is what we found. Endless life, endless creation, a world beneath our feet, teaching us to step gingerly. I'm going to move now to the section that comes from this work, and I hope you see how it relates. I'm going to read from the catalog, which is available. I only brought one copy because you have to go see the show and see the work there. So I want to start by talking about my generation. I do not mean some oddball adaptation of a Roger Daltrey triple generation, although we'll come back to that. But I begin by talking about my generation, my way of generating, in this case, regenerating, as a pathway through to understanding the past. And to triple down on that would be a regeneration, as a pathway to understanding our future. I was in my early 20s when I first read Eliot, referencing Heraclitus, the way forward is the way back. And in my 30s, when I visited Aotearoa and heard Maori friends and philosophers note that we're really all walking backwards into the future. All of this is time travel and ways through to the future past and finding a material practice to do the same. And so I was in my early 60s when I went to visit my partner, performance artist, scientist, and philosopher Ayumi Goto in Ino, a small township in the prefecture of Kochi on the island of Shikoku on the archipelagic nation of Japan. She was there working at a washi operation, and that the bottom image is really close to where the river where the operation was. It's a traditional one-stop paper-making site where the product was featured in all stages. The workers traveled to neighboring farmlands, as you see above, where they had permission to harvest kozo, mulberry branches. It was hard mountainside labor, and because an aging rural Japanese population meant dwindling workers, the operation depended on numerous woofers, national and international volunteers who worked organic farms and operations like this one for free in exchange for room and board and a chance to see the world. They would stay for periods of a couple to a few weeks or maybe a month or two before moving to the next job, living inexpensively and seeing the Japanese countryside. Here, the owner is also named Ayumi, Ayumi Hamada, the daughter of a since-passed generational mill manager and herself theater-educated in Canada, set up not just the woofer harvest, but an artist residency that featured creators such as Ayumi Goto, who worked with paper. Ayumi would join the woofers in their daily treks to precarious precipices, where they would use various traditional and modern instruments, such as you see the other Ayumi there working, to sever thin branches from the plots of kozo bushes. These they would tie and shoulder back to the work truck, and after a day of heavy cutting and lifting and endurance of heat and rain, return to the operation site where they would share collective dinners. On subsequent days, they and local townsfolk, including the aged and infirm who were not able to sustain mountain treks but would work in the mill and perform the intricate task demanded of them, would sit before piles of kozo branches, carefully and expertly stripping them layer by layer. The inner bark of the fibrous material was their prize, and only that inner bark, just 4% of the kozo branch, was saved for the mill, with the rest of the outer bark and branches being sent off as refuse, although sometimes used as material for fence building. Although as time and nature regenerates, it was also common practice to mulch the outer bark, bag it, and return it to the next season's crop. Back at the mill, the inner bark of the recent harvest was mulched and boiled, and following an intricate and long-standing practice imported from China in the 7th century, was eventually strained through screens to become a most prized possession, where the highest quality handmade washi, so durable and sustainable, can last for up to 1,000 years. In the evenings, Ayumi would take sheets of this amazing paper to the rooftops of the cliffside buildings where the operation was located, and she would dance with the washi. It seemed like only the occasional tired woofer, the resident cat, a handful of crows, and my own photographic eye would be watching over her perform the dance the dance of the ages. One of the other artists in residence, a textile creator, Alexa Hatanaka, made Ayumi a dress made entirely of washi. And at one point during their residency, Ayumi performed in that dress on this infinity deck at an onsen near Cape Ashizuri on the southern tip of the island. There, a group of 3 elderly women watched her, and in conversation were so excited by this practice, invited her to visit with them in a nearby town so they could learn more from this diasporic material artist. But I get ahead of myself in this generation of a tale, for I followed the woofers several times to the harvest, and I sat with them in the dark of the factory floors as they struggled and stripped and mulched the kozo. And as I watched the living branches transmogrified into washi. Now, I was trained as a photojournalist decades ago, but my eye was focused on what stories the images could tell. But I soon ascertained that simply illustrating the process was not significant enough, and I wanted to regenerate a pathway back. I decided I wanted to print these photographs on washi, which is often used by printmakers, and there's probably printmakers in the room, but had no real history of being used as a photographic medium because of the constraints of the chemical process. I consulted one of my peers, Jay Irazawa, and he told me there was a process of mixing platinum and palladium drops to convert any surface into one that's photosensitive. Now, I found a mentoring process at Gallery 44 in Toronto, just down the street from OCAD, where I was paired with a gentleman named Jerry Pietrzowski, and I'm going to do a show with him in Toronto when I get back. He's a master in platinum palladium printing. I met with him and explained how I wanted to take photographs documenting the harvest, the washi making, and the performance with the paper, but in cyclical fashion. I wanted to print on the very washi that I had photographed being harvested as kozo. He was very supportive, although he later admitted he was skeptical it was actually be able to work. But he taught me the process, and I became somewhat proficient, but with the skill of a child drawing their first landscape. I wasn't very good at this. I was exhilarated, but I also was aware of my limitations, and then I came to Jerry and said, because I realized he was a master printer, could I hire him to do the prints for me? So when you go to the gallery in Block D, you'll see what you're seeing here are black and whites, but you'll see the ones that are actually printed on washi with that process. He generously obliged to print this for me, and the size of the images was quite large, so he had to create his own special set of tools, because the paper, this 1,000-year washi, is very, very durable, but it's also very fragile when it's wet, so he had to create very special tools to move it through. Now, the very last image of the catalog is this one, and what it does is it shows the stacks of kozo. This is the original color image, the unstripped one on the left and the stripped one on the right, and this is the process of turning it into a print on washi. The black that you see on the side is the platinum palladium process that takes it there. So these are the images of the harvest, the mill, and of Ayumi. She danced with the very paper on which the images are printed. You can see what I'm going with, this notion of cyclical process and regeneration. I am older now, and my cycle of life looks back on itself. It looks back to look forward. And I know that unlike the washi, I do not have 1,000 years ahead of me, but I do have these photographs, and I do have the poetry that brings them back into my generation. I'm going to stop now and pass it on over to Ayumi, who will take this to, I'm sure, a great another level. So thank you so much.
There are so many thank yous that Ashok has provided, but I do want to thank Paul, Tim, Charlotte, Wendy, and all of the people who helped us to make this happen today. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I thank you very much to be present for this talk. I have pre-recorded my talk, and in the meantime, I will be moving around the room. I wasn't sure if I was going to say this, but the story that Ashok told about the daughter and the father was my story, is my story. And I want to give a nod to my mother because she's one of the most powerful women I know. And we had gone through a lot of violence when we were growing up. And so when I was younger, after that happened, I would weekend after weekend, I would go to meet with my father to confront him and shout at him. And finally my mother took me aside and she said, "Oh, Ayumi, you still don't understand. When somebody is about to lose their humanity, you don't push them further away. You have to pull them closer in." And when she said that, it changed the very nature of the way my father and I were able to actually reconcile. And he and I ended up becoming best friends before he passed. But some of that, you'll hear about my mother and father in a different context, but they're actually happening at the same time.
The surface shimmers of belonging, two-dimensional reflective containment captured, finger-pointing, painting strong borders, those privy to inclusion and those deprived thereof. This writing emerges in Takamatsu, where I have set up a temporary artist residency, an experiment in alternative pedagogical practice, hopefully generating momentary creative solace and spaces of making. Canals run on both sides of the road. The sound of water rushing, trickling, and flowing surrounds all movements. You may think that one naturally assumes their identity from their country of birth, but while born in Canada, neither English nor French was my first language. Japanese as a mother tongue is a language that I don't remember learning, but one that I remember forgetting and keep having to relearn. I have vivid memories of learning English, missed communications leading to comedy and tragedy in equal parts. But Japanese, it is the language of the night's last sounds as I drift off to sleep and the first intonations at the start of the new day. It is the language that holds and nurtures my emotions in the entirety of range: violence, joy, desolation, shame, confusion, surprise, love. And it is a language that helps me to dream, both in wake and sleep lives. Yet my speech often stutters, trips over the tongue, drawls into hesitation and self-doubts. The English language is strange and estranged. It lives outside of my body. Words, big and small, seem to float like dust particles hovering beyond the skin's surface. The mouth knows how to take shape to convey audible meaning, to place myself into dialogue with English-speaking others. But the poetic inflections of each syllable seem to lose their momentum through the clumsy gestures of performing speech. I am not insinuating that the capacity to speak one's mother tongue provides a direct link and entry to one's culture. Although not insinuating this now, until recently, in these current moments of questioning my Japaneseness, must admit that yes, I had assumed that being able to speak the mother language was somehow linked to a sense of cultural authenticity, of truly belonging. But belonging to a culture, in a culture, is so much more than being able to communicate in the language of said state, even while it is one's birth language. It could be that an exaggerated designation of being Japanese is in part an outcome of growing up in Canada. My parents arrived in Canada on the precipice of 1970, after immigration policies shifted from race to skills and education-based assessments. On paper, it was the federal government's nascent attempt to eliminate at least overt racial discrimination in the application process. My parents, raised and educated in Japan, could not speak, read, or write English. Up until Dad's passing, and up until this day, Mum still struggles with basic English comprehension. As she ages, English words just fall away, almost like the shedding of snakeskin. Throughout her life in Canada, her linguistic hesitations have been mistaken as evidence of intellectual weakness. But bearing witness to how the public treated those who spoke English as a second language and with a thick accent did not stop with the familial, for I grew up in an environment peopled with newcomers, many arriving as business-sponsored refugees. Dad and Mum sponsored families and individuals primarily from Vietnam, others from Cambodia, as well as economic migrants from across Asia, Japan, Korea, China, and very few from the Philippines and Thailand. The mushroom farm that my parents owned and operated, and consequently our house, became a never-ending cycle of welcoming new employees while bidding farewell to those who wished to venture elsewhere. Some would move to more urban locations such as Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal, while others would go much further afield, such as Australia and New Zealand, many maintaining the hope of eventually returning home. In the meantime, they found themselves in an unexpected and unimaginable place. In the case of asylum seekers from Vietnam and Cambodia, they were tentatively invited by the federal government in deals made with the provinces and local businesses. These businesses, which were often planted in rural settings, my parents included, would have agreed to sponsor asylum seekers, to provide regular incomes, financial backing in times of emergency, committing to being a social economic cushion, and reassurances that these newcomers would not be a perpetual financial drain on taxpayers, but rather seen as viable contributors to growing the Canadian economy. A pessimistic part of me wonders in retrospect if such a welcoming may well have been for want of an influx of cheap manual labor to fill positions that others deemed too below their training or status. But life and the ongoing critical rewriting of history provides a much more complex understanding. I was too young to understand the effect of the Hai Hong boat incident and what it would have had upon the international community in witnessing the movement of displaced Vietnamese people. I was also too young to know that both Canada and France were the first two countries to respond humanely to this human emergency. Between 1975 and into the late 1990s, Canada accepted 200,000 refugees coming from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and from other Southeast Asian countries. My own memories are much closer proximity, in the everyday, participating in the ever-revolving roles of welcoming and then saying goodbye. From the outset, from the arrival of the very first refugees, Dad instilled in my siblings and me our collective responsibility as a family to ensure the successful integration of the newcomers. Through corporal punishment and incontestable directives, we were bombarded with the message that if the farm failed, then the future lives of these families would be filled with further suffering beyond what they had already endured. Would we be able to live with their social and economic precarity? When my father passed in 2006, I was inundated with stories relayed to me by those whom my parents had sponsored. One woman came up to me at Dad's funeral and began talking rapidly, stating that she and her family had arrived in the middle of the night amidst an Albertan winter. They had been moved into one of the trailer homes on the farm property and, not knowing what to do, roamed around inside, peering out of the windows to see snow blowing and billowing over the prairied landscape. She said that they kept looking at each other, bewildered, asking over and over aloud, to no one in particular, "What are we doing here?" Suddenly, the family was shaken out of their disorientation by a large banging on the front door. They furtively opened it to see my dad with a giant sack of rice on his shoulders. He shouted with a big, toothsome smile, "Welcome, Canada!" unceremoniously dropping the heavy load onto the kitchen floor and leaving as quickly as he had entered. She said at that moment she knew that they would be okay. But those moments of okayness were disrupted by the barrages of racism. Before Mom and Dad started the farm, only a handful of Asian families lived in the small town. With a population of around 1,600 at the time, non-whites were highly visible. One Chinese family owned the local discount general store. Two others owned Chinese Canadian restaurants. When the farm opened, the sudden influx of Asians increased this minority population by approximately 8-fold. To my memory, of those who arrived to work at the farm, no one spoke English as a first language. It was often their second, third, and sometimes fourth language. Many of the children and young adults were placed in grades far below their age and intellectual capacities. They would find themselves in the eternal recurrence of repeating the same grade level until their linguistic proficiency improved to the point that they could adequately understand the class lesson. I recall one young teen from Cambodia who must have been 14 or so. He was placed in grade 3. Lanky with long tapered fingers, arms and legs, shoulders far above his classmates, he was bullied relentlessly by the teachers and the other students just because he couldn't understand English. I recall that he kept smiling no matter what was thrown at him, but this just led to even more bullying. Whenever the latest family arrived, my sister and I would worry about how the children would fit into school. I'm suddenly flooded with vivid memories of my sister and me skipping out on our own classes to check up on the new students. The small rectangular windows on the classroom doors were high up, so much so that we would have to jump to peer into the classroom to see how they were doing. When the workers first arrived, they carried so little. As a child, I would wonder how they could fit their whole lives into 1 or 2 suitcases. Some came with even less. In witnessing this perennial sequence of arriving, carrying, accumulating, shedding, and then regrouping for departure, at age 8, I decided to compile my own escape bag. Over time, The following were neatly folded into a plain navy blue rucksack. A worn pair of jeans, 2 tops, one long-sleeved, the other a t-shirt, chocolate bars and chips, which had to be replaced frequently, a small red pouch filled with coins scrounged from around the house, always a book. This too was replaced, but not as frequently as the snacks. This survival pack remained a constant sleeping companion, hooked to the foot of my bed up until graduation day. Exercises in having to guess, choosing what might become precious and what might become physically or emotionally burdensome has rippled throughout history, across communities, nations, cutting through familial ties, friendships, in the crossing of entrenched borders, patrolled by those who have the power to override your decisions and confiscate accordingly. Kizaku Ishiki, being and longing merged through the enactment of one's consciousness to become part of some place, time, grouping. But what happens if belonging emerges in movement rather than being in a state of suspension? Nothing is permanent. Everything can change in an instant. Belonging, diving into the flow and tempos of bodies in motion. Kizoku Ishiki makes a lot more sense in the travels between being human and other specious beings. A sense of family or familiarity is not restricted to a singular group or order. Language here lends itself to exceeding anthropic culture. Yet, and maybe consequently, in the merging of human and non-humans, human-to-human interactions become more rigid. The insider quickly assesses the manner of outsideness of the outsider. One can easily find themselves to be an outsider if they are from a different village, town, prefecture, region, island, nation. Their outsideness is also determined by time. How long have you lived here? There, away. While it is not often readily clear who is in the position to declare insideness, it is nonetheless felt as two magnets repulsed in their likenesses. Is there a possible link between nationalism and land insecurity? For moral philosopher and historian Watsuji Tetsuro, the land is at once the site of danger and embodied belonging. This is not a surprising conclusion, considering that Japan is a country inundated with tsunamis, typhoon, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. The winters are bitterly cold and the summers are stiflingly muggy, but once again, it depends on the parts to which one seeks to belong, the invitation in equal parts of provocation. One morning in Takamatsu, intending to reach Sanuki, I'm caught in light rain during my run. The thunder seems to echo closer in with every step, and the misty rainfall suddenly transforms into a deluge of water that crashes down in striated sheets. My shivering body seeks protection from the thunderstorm under the eave of a Shinto shrine, but soon the land mesmerizes. Atmospheric puddles glide like giant fish scales on the pavement's surface. The sidewalk becomes Toshiyoshi's carp, slithering a path to the next house, temple, street lamp. The next morning, I venture again toward Sanuki, an alternative route, and although the sky promises the holding off of seasonal showers, this time the pitch darkness of the tunnel has me scurrying away like a frightened rodent. No other pedestrians or bicyclists dare take this route. In the third attempt, yet another path, this time an ancient mountain road, pavement cracking away from inclement weather and disuse. The overgrown trees on both sides of the road greedily entangle to create a passageway even less illuminated than the tunnel. This time, I say aloud, "Fuck it," and begin burrowing through the mountain. Minutes turn to hours. Precipitation gives way to some pockets. then revert to summer showers. This time, in staying the course, I arrive at Sanuki, finally, only to perambulate for a short while before embarking on the return home. Home temporarily is one shared with two others, an experimental residency in a small village in the southeast corner of Takamatsu. A post office is 100 meters away, a Buddhist temple venerating Kannon directly in front, and to the left, a local community center. Just a bit further on, a bakery is less than a 5 minutes walk, and then a skip to the local family mart. In living here temporarily, I'm currently part of this community. As an impermanent resident, I'm learning again, having forgotten the small steps of building a sense of community in the here and now. How does the surface mirror itself into place? The performance of one's culture reconstitutes past and future movements. In coming to Takamatsu this time around, I've been wondering if I have been living under some type of cultural delusion. In Canada, there's both a spoken and unspoken demand that one knows one's culture, presenting the authentic self. This is the perseverance of the modernist project within the state of the great perpetual undoing, deconstructing self, other, state, nation. Beneath the veneer of critiques that break things apart, we have not actually let go of reconstituting a self that is impervious to fracture. In performing Japaneseness, cultural cosplay, caricaturing one's senses of being, it is very difficult to vocalize this. My throat squeezes shut with anxiety, and I'm fearful of the possibility that for so long I have conflated my sense of self with the capacity to perform people's cultural fantasies. The either-orness of languaging belonging in binary opposition to not belonging speaks to my failure to be cognizant of and to practice the in-betweenness and flows between the two. That belonging and not belonging can be mutually experienced rather than being mutually exclusive. There are benefits to not being a permanent fixture in a grouping. Some of those in the permanent group might feel at ease with confiding in someone who will not remain. There may be things that cannot be spoken to others who are much more permanently fixed in the community, for fear that eventually such secrets will be revealed. In the flow of languages, bodies intermingling for a short while, the cyclicality of arrivals and departures, the invaluable treasure of not belonging is to present with us with a choice, even if and especially when we are painfully aware of not belonging, do we turn away further still from those seeking shelter? Do we create heavily surveilled borders dividing those who move like us from those whose tempos differ? Or do we say, fuck it, trudge on through toward the next unexpected encounters? In contemplating belonging from a nationalized cultural lens, it dawns on me that infinite lenses exist from which belonging and not belonging can exist simultaneously, coincidentally. At times they meet up, rivulets that feed into larger river systems, while at other times they evaporate, re-precipitate, taking on new forms. The singular self, through meiotic mitosis, splits and travels beyond prior givens. This tear is a piece of what once was, the diaspora of being, the shedding of skin, uncontrollable travels, a voice disembodied, the memories that transform into indelible beginnings. Everywhere, from the smallest to largest streets of Takamatsu, you're surrounded by the sound of rushing water. Water that streams and shapeshifts through multiple states of being, gas, liquid, solid, life-saving and life-taking in equal measure. Water reflects timelessness and timeliness, amalgamation and dispersal. It is within each of us to entangle old and new pathways. Interbeing returns.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such moving and powerful rumination and performance. What we're going to do now is to kind of open it up for reflections, for questions, or for comments, or however you may want to contribute to make this a shared space. So I'd like to open up. Please hold your hand up, and we can come and give you the mic to say something. While you're reflecting on that, I took some notes and some things that I was thinking about. And there were some things that I think both of you said, both verbally and non-verbally, that I thought were really powerful. Ashok, your question of how to read relational love in these dire times, or in those dire times, I think you said, seems like a really powerful question, right? How to read relational love in these dire times. It feels like we don't hear as much about love in relation to what's happening in the world right now. And obviously, a lot of what both of you were talking about and enacting and embodying is about the personal, is about personal histories, personal identities, personal experiences and families. But obviously, when you talked about, for example, Godzilla as a response to nuclear destruction and a global death, it has a wider resonance. So I wonder if you could just say perhaps a little bit, Ashok, or maybe just to reflect. And also, I think equally, Ayumi, this question of relational love comes across in your work as well, and sort of really powerful testimony to love, trauma, and other emotions that come across. But love, I think, is a really important thing to talk about at this time. So, Ashok, Ayumi, what does relational love mean at this particular moment, and how do you draw on it in your practices? That's what I would like to start with. I don't know if you want to both come to the front, maybe put some chairs. So, okay.
You go first.
Yeah, I mean, and Paul, you've hit on of course what I've been struggling with, what we've both been struggling with, is in critical times like this, how do we still see past the borders that are being placed for us? And sometimes those borders are socially mediated. Sometimes they are hyper-constructed. In other words, you can talk about love only in the familiar. I love the people that believe the same things that I believe. And this is what it ultimately leads. What I talked about leading to destruction and to war, is if you cannot see the other, right? And I use in the text I use it as capital O, other, in like a Levinas kind of way. Like, how do you see the face of the other? If you cannot do that, then you've already reached an impasse. And I do think the way we've constructed and worked within media right now is deeply troubling, because what it does is it says you can only, it's binaristic. You choose that side, you have to stay at that side, right? And I fall into that too. I don't want to hear people spouting what I consider to be offensive rhetoric, right-wing positionality, that type of thing. But if I turn it off, then and say it doesn't exist, or I simply dismiss it, then I cannot reach out. So it can't be relational, right? Now that's a very hard thing for me to do, right? To say, well, how can I relate to that which I find troubling or offensive? And yet that's the thing, the space we're in. I don't think we have a salvation except to be able to reach across the aisle. as difficult as that is. And I know very few people who can do that. I don't think I'm successful at that at all. I think an ultimate failure. But I see it within activist communities. I see it within artistic communities. You know, this is who we are. We are only this, and everyone else is over there. So I'm not answering the question well because it's a pure and simple dilemma, and it's almost oxymoronic. You know, it's an almost impossible place to be. So that said, my hope comes from that. My hope and optimism comes from the idea of that relationality. If in the height of despair, of violence, you can reach out and say, I need something from you, and that something is provided, then maybe there's that glimmer of hope, you know. But it's not going to go away. But unless as artists and as thinkers, as creatives, we do something to do that, to reach across, we are ultimately going to be in enclaves that are just as dangerous as being in an oppositional space. We just are amongst our own, and we refuse to see what can possibly be out of the other, which is difficult for me to say because, you know, I'm not willing to go change myself ideologically to support something that I find, especially something that's, you know, offensive or dangerous or violent, but I do need to understand it.
That's a good answer. The response will take me to kind of a strange conversation, but it does really connect. My undergraduate is in microbiology, and I specialized in immunology. And afterward, I did a lot of HIV work before I started to do art. But the reason I started to do art was because of my dissatisfaction with how I had been trained scientifically. I was in Kenya in 1997. The HIV virus was very, very virulent, and there wasn't a lot of hope. Our whole families died. And I was working at an HIV hospice. Before that, I had been in Ghana, where I had been asked to do an HIV lesson plan. And that was when I was starting to become dissatisfied with my training, thinking that our scientific understanding was too simplistic, fight or flight. So one of the things I saw at the HIV hospice in Kenya was how healthy the babies were. They were all HIV positive, but they were healthy. They were rosy-cheeked, putting on weight. And it was because of the work. So the hospice was set up as not as medical practitioners and the patients, but mothers. So there were designated mothers, and I was one of the designated mothers. And we were given like 3 or 4 children who would be our children. And so what I found with this dynamic was that we weren't there to do a professional job that was purely at a physiological level. It was changing the nature of medicine itself in that hospice. So going beyond the fight or flight, it was a really big eye-opener for me because I thought from the most basic knowledge that we're taught, right, fight or flight, the thing that we forgot was care. And so when I was working with the mothers at the hospice, and once you were HIV positive, the prognosis was very poor. Most people died within 2 years of being diagnosed with HIV in 1997 in Kenya. And so I asked the mothers, well, do you get tested for HIV? And they said, why bother? Because even if I'm tested, I'm going to die anyway. And then one mother said, if we're so worried about being infected, then we couldn't do the more important job of caring for these children. And it was such a big wake-up call for me. It was not this infected or non-infected, fight or flight, but care. Even when people are most afraid, there is a sizable amount of the population, human population, who will choose to care. This has taken me to the direction of this idea of shape-shifting activism, not to choose a side, but to think as creatives, like every one of you in this room, art, what is the role of art right now? If we're contesting it, but it's a fight, we're going to be mirroring. But as creatives, I think we can be quite expansive in the way that we reach toward one another, this interrelationality, the manifestation and the articulation of love that doesn't push people away.
Okay. Are there any questions? And I'd like to apologise a little bit. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties for people online hearing us because of the different mics. Don't worry, there's nothing much we can do about it. So I apologise for that, but thank you, Maria. Take care. Are there any questions, thoughts, comments, anything online, Mel?
Yeah, we have online. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Canenza has a reflection and a question. I really loved your lecture. It truly touched my heart. The part about how the English language lives outside of the body really stayed with me and before things felt so raw and vulnerable. As a Southeast Asian who also deals with the idea of not belonging, I've been thinking a lot about how language violence and collective memory intertwine, how the mother tongue, something so nurturing and motherly, can also feel alienating and carry its own kind of pain. In your practice, how do you hold or balance that tenderness that the pain it carries? And do you ever find moments where language, despite its distance, becomes a place of healing or return?
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you. It's such a rich reflection and question, a complex question. Japanese and languages are very strange for me. I believe that through 3 languages, I also speak French very, very, very poorly, but I can read and write it and stuff. But so these 3 languages, I think I can barely cobble together the vocabulary of one language between the 3 languages. But sometimes I find in working between the distance of different languages, I have this actual visual picture where there are these giant caverns or cliffs. And when Japanese is here, English is here, French is here, and I try to run as hard as possible, but sometimes I fall into the crevice. And I'm just going, ah! But it's in that moment that I think creativity is birthed. And so when I anchor myself up through one of the languages, it changes my relationship to that language, and then it also changes my relationship to flying. But I also think that there's a lot of romanticizing about this idea of mother tongue. I think any language, regardless of whether you're born into it or you're forced to learn or you wish to learn, there's a lot of trauma involved. Because part of you is being taken away. Some parts, there'll never be any translation, and other parts, they can actually cause harm. So I think sometimes, I hope that people are able to go into that void, that crevice where sound is absent, I think. And in the absence of sound, the languages and their nonsensical power over also gets released as well.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I think we need this as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. It's so intriguing. I want to ask you about this relational love from a Canadian perspective. I wasn't born in Canada, but I was educated there. I don't feel at home in Canada. I don't really feel at home in the UK. And I think many Canadians right now are also really struggling with this question of what does it mean to feel at home in their own country. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the tensions between Canada and the US, the creative responses to those tensions, because I think what you're suggesting is that there might be some space to respond in a way where nationally the emphasis seems to be on pushing apart, but maybe regionally or in terms of at a community level, there's a different way to negotiate that. It'd be great to get some examples.
I think I can start off that. Thanks, Marcia, for that question and provocation, really. It brings to mind, of course, many things, but one of them is the deep problematics of nationalism. And I've never actually seen a way to positively spin that. It just seems that it always takes us into this abyss, right? So the example that you're giving, for instance, the Canadian and American dichotomy, binarism, it frustrates me to see colleagues or people sharing citizenship, becoming more aware of their, and I'll say proud of this national status in opposition to, because we're not that, then we're this, right? That's a terrible way to identify, to say because we're not that, we're this. And it just leads into that abyss that we're talking about, where we're not able to see ourselves fully because we want to be one thing, right? And if we're in opposition to something, I don't think we can survive. In my experience, I was born in India, grew up in Canada, and I remember my parents talking, and their friends and their family, with this romantic longing for the motherland, right? To say, reminds me of India, this is so beautiful, this is like there. And yet, they had chosen distinctly to be diasporic and not to ever resettle there. Even my father, as he grew older and think of, his life, would not want to return there. And in the 80s and 90s, mainly the 90s, there was a major festival in Canada called Desh Pradesh, which was about, and that translates to the idea of land and paradisal land, like a homeland, a beautiful land, paradise. And it was kind of ironic, and it was done through a queer diasporic space, so almost all queer South Asian artists who would enunciate. They'd say, well, we can't be in that home because that's too conservative. We couldn't exist in that space, and yet there's still this desire for that. So I don't know what to make of that, and there's something positive about desire, but also when it's inflected by nationalism, particularly the nationalism of today and where it's going, I think it's deeply troubling, and it creates the breeding ground for that kind of hatred. It's Swiftian in many ways. You put your egg upside down, I'm going to kill you, that type of thing. But that's where we're at right now, and I think we have to recomplexify. I would love to see us be able to dissolve the notion of the nation state, and yet maintain the integrity of, say, what we talked about and touched on, a land-based culture. Like if we're on a certain land, that's not a nation. It's got nothing to do with a nation. But what it is a place to plant our feet, and as we plant our feet, we watch the plants coming up around them. Right? Now that's a sense of belonging, but it's also idyllic in its own way.
Yes, thank you for the question. I was thinking a lot about the difference between, or how we were taught the difference between the U.S. and Canada, that the U.S. is the melting pot and Canada is multiculturalism. And when we were taught that, or when I was taught that, it was this idea that we kind of got it better. But I think in effect what it is that Canada is multiculturalism of binationalism. So what I mean by that is that when immigrants or newcomers come into the country, you're made to be proud of the country that you're from, and then you're made to be proud of the country that you have entered. And then when people are dealing with a binationalism, it leads to further nationalism, I think, instead of creating more divisions and between different communities if you happen to come from a different cultural background. In the U.S., there are so many great examples. Two come to mind of belonging that has nothing to do with the nation state, but it has to do with the context and the power of humans to overcome kind of like the hegemonies or like the political pressures at the time. So the first example is this group in Vermont called Migrants for Justice. And in Vermont, there's a lot of dairy farming. And so the dairy farming community is comprised of many, many like multi-generational American dairy farmers and then migrant workers from Mexico. The migrant workers for this kind of like temporary laborers, you don't need documentation. But they had issues that once they got to the U.S., they couldn't get a driver's license, and you really needed a car to drive in the countryside. And so the farming community, so primarily white dairy farmers, and the migrant workers from Mexico came together, and they changed the laws there in Vermont so that Mexican migrant workers could get driver's license without showing proof of documentation. Currently, it's difficult because of ICE, so a number of people who were given awards, like the Mexican migrant workers, were arrested by ICE just even like a couple of weeks ago. But what that example shows is that instead of arching everything toward the giant impact or the big picture. It's the interrelational love. It's the interest of the fellow human or the person or the being in front of you, not necessarily human, that can actually create a rooting system that ultimately has some type of strength against the winds of fascism, actually. The second example is in Oakland, California. So there's a large number of African-American single-parent women in particular and their children who were living on the street. And so they took up this one house in Oakland, and they just took over it. And they were really smart about the way they shared their stories with the media. So they had a multimedia pronged approach. It's called Moms for Justice. And they started telling stories about how families ended up being on the street, also having multiple platforms like Facebook, Instagram, multiple apps. And it changed the community to recognize, and now there are several houses that Moms for Justice legally own because the larger community saw that they didn't have to fit into corporate interests in terms of housing, but that everyone deserved housing. So there are great examples, I think, that show working together, living together.
I want to make a brief comment about this notion, this human centricity. Because when we talk about nation, we talk about relationality, we're often talking about the human. And one of the things that you would have seen with what Ayumi was doing is, and I'd like her to talk about this actually, is these brushes that she had, and she was wrapping at the end. And it's a beautiful story because it's got really nothing to do with humans, but it has to do with experience. Could you speak to those brushes? Because that's such an interesting project.
Okay, so I have a dream to do, and I love chikurin, which is the Japanese word for bamboo forest. I just have a strange affinity toward chikurin. And I even think the word chikurin doesn't sound like a human word. I think it sounds like a word that birds were like kind of chirping, like chikurin, chikurin, chikurin. And then a human was walking along in the forest and was like, it is a chikurin. And then since then, I was thinking, I want to do an anime from telling the story from the perspective of the bamboo forest itself. And so what I did last year is I spent a month in Matsuyama, which is the capital of the island of Shikoku, it's of the prefecture, sorry. And then I ran to multiple locations, to many chikurin, harvested bamboo, and then I took my hair, and then I made paintbrushes out of my hair. And I planted them 8 or 9 paintbrushes around like Matsuyama, primarily in forested areas, because I wanted to know how the hairbrush, the paintbrush would absorb the stories of the forest, absorb the stories of the sky, absorb the stories of the water, of storms, of the sunshine. So I left them there for 1 year, and then this year I went back and I found 5 of them. 4 of them I could not find, but I can already hear their stories. But the one that I left behind, I had left it in a very, very small temple up the hilltop of quite a steep mountain area. And there was a little temple there. But when I went to retrieve it, it was so well taken care of. So it was really clear that the groundskeepers were taking care of the paintbrush. And then when I went to take it, I could hear the paintbrush saying, I don't want to go. So I realized that it was no longer for me to take, and it's living its own life. I think it's very speaking of diaspora. But then the other paintbrushes I brought back. And since then, they show up in dreams. One of the things that I didn't account for when I planted these different paintbrushes in the forest was that of the life that would develop inside of the paintbrush. So when I first retrieved the first one, suddenly there were these juicy black ants that were coming, they were suddenly in the apartment. I'm like, where are the ants coming from? Where are the ants? I'm like, oh, it's from the paintbrush. And so last night I had this dream of these black bubbles, like the kind of the hind part of the ants, developing on my fingers, and I was going like this. And I realized that through dreams, the paintbrushes are actually telling the stories that they want me to tell, which will become the anime, I hope. We'll see.
Ayumi, I wanted to just ask a little bit about the performance.
Sure.
I loved the performance. I thought it's such a precise, but yet, powerful, emotional set of actions. And I thought it was a really interesting contrast between the kind of intentionality that you both talked about, the need for a kind of intentionality in terms of being, in terms of performativity, as you mentioned about performing Japaneseness, and that kind of thing, and the question of ritual. But then there was a sort of violence in the way that you tore the canvas, which was a little bit shocking. Because such a beautiful thing. When you did that, I thought, what is she doing? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that dialectic, that kind of rupture, which I think was a really strong way of kind of communicating what you were trying to do.
To be honest, it was very, very, very painful for me to rip that up. So please take care of if you have received one.
And then being so generous too.
Please. Yeah, I think that's an experience of the breakages and the dispersal of the self. That it isn't a unified being that goes from place to place. But when we travel from one location, or when we live lives, say you're coming from another country, but you're in England for some time for studies, you become a different self. So then there are multiple selves of you that don't necessarily link back up. They might end up continually moving further and further away from each other. That scroll I made was made in Takamatsu this past year, just July. And I used indigo, airo, and with jaggery, so it's like palm sugar, to dye it. And then I did watercolors. So some of the locations that I mentioned in the talk, so the temple right in front of the place where we're staying, I painted that temple, and I implanted it into the washi. But I think of all of the families that came through the mushroom farm and how little they had, and then they would have to leave things behind when they went to the new location. And every time it's painful. Every time you leave something that you know that you will miss, but you can't carry it with you. And so it was an act of, I guess, what is that word? An act of release, or just saying, I will share this part of me with you. Because if this is the only encounter we have, is that not better that something was shared, that something was given in earnest, than to have a conflict, to have a fight? So there is a lot of violence in it, and it's a violation of, I think, the image that we often create of a unified self. But once we let that go, once we become like water, then maybe one of those times, some bits of ourselves will come streaming past us. So, and that represents, the scroll represented all of the water I kept hearing on my runs. Like, you hear water all the time, and I thought, wow, this is kind of a good metaphor for living in different places at the same time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Are there any? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your performance and your talk. But I can't help but ask, so many women don't survive that moment.
Yeah.
And your whole thesis is based on the fact that you've survived. But actually, that's not usually the case.
Mm-hmm.
So, and equally when, I mean, you talk about seeing, actually, the whole point of ideology is that it prevents you from seeing. So what is happening in Palestine and Israel is not that, because actually they don't even have the privilege of that. And I'm talking actually in both relation to Israelis, they cannot see, but they are not seen on purpose. That is their privilege. And then the reverse is, well, there is not a reverse, but also there is not that time. You had the time to reach out. We're not every one of us are given that time. So, yeah.
I'm going to jump in here, but before I respond, because I was thinking, and you're absolutely right, and it's a beautiful but difficult notion, right? What if, actually, the very first performance Ayumi did was in a park. There's a piece called Commemoration, and she's a runner, so she's always running. This was in Vancouver. She'd run across the city, and she was always attracted to this park called Oppenheimer Park, and it was a lot of history there. It was where the Japanese Canadians were settled, but also where they were taken away. And it's become a meeting ground for a lot of indigenous populations. And there's, in Canada, there's a crisis with indigenous women and girls who've been murdered or gone missing from violence. And so Ayumi's performance, which invoked a Japanese history, but also was thinking of these women and girls, and she was doing this beautiful performance dressed as a geisha and releasing these balloons into the sky. And I was photographing it, and I remember thinking, how are people going to read this? And there were a couple of older indigenous men there, and they said to one another, one fellow saying to the other, he said, what's this about? And the other one says, I don't really know what it's about, but I think it's about our sisters, right? Those people who have been lost. So I think that was a beautiful thing. So thinking of those who don't have the privilege, cannot survive, it's our duty to be responsive to them.
Yeah, I have thank you for that comment and question. I became interested in reconciliation, and I did a lot of work. I went to Rwanda, I went to Northern Ireland, I went to Australia, I went to South Africa, because I wanted to see if reconciliation ultimately was an alternative discourse to war metaphors in our understanding of immunology and microbiology. But what I came across over and over again was that two sides that were at war, and often very unequal circumstances, that there was this pressure that you had to choose one or the other side. But then what happened once there was, after all that violence, how do you reconcile that? So in Northern Ireland, there was a psychologist named Brandon Hamber, who's South African, and during the TRC in South Africa, he actually ended up setting up psychology booths for people who gave public testimony, because he found that there was this idea or this assumption that once people gave testimony of what they had lived through, their traumas, that they would feel healed, but that wasn't the case. They became more mentally disturbed, and it led to more conflict and a lot of mental health issues. So what he did, but he moved to Northern Ireland, and then so after the Troubles, he and Willem Verwoerd. So Willem Verwoerd was the grandson or the great grandson of one of the architects of apartheid, and he was so disturbed by his legacy of his ancestry that he, as a moral philosopher, he was doing everything in his capacity to change the state of relations in South Africa. So what Brandon and Willem did was that they brought together people who served for the DUP and people who served for the IRA, and 5 men on each side. They had all killed on each side. And they would meet together, but ultimately they they took the 10 men to South Africa, and they had to survive in the bush. And then this is when it was and the men were there afterwards and talking about how they didn't realize how close and mirrored their actions were, and how close and mirrored their values were, until they were put into this other environment where they had to rely on each other to survive. The venerable monk Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese monk, he was one of the Vietnamese refugees. He ended up in France, right? Plum Village, he started it. But he was chased out of Vietnam because he refused to side with the southern Vietnamese, and so they didn't trust him. He refused to side with the northern Vietnamese, and so they were certain that he was a spy for the southern Vietnamese. And so in not choosing a side, he became the next danger and he knew that he couldn't survive. It wasn't easy. There is the privilege of reflection, definitely. But I also think that there is sometimes a duty to think of other ways, other angles, other lenses to look at a conflict. Because if we keep going back and forth, the killings keep continuing on both sides. And as a microbiologist, as a scientist, I can see that that warfare at the macroscopic level has led to us at the microscopic level to continue that conflict, which leads to long-term diseases, which leads to inexplicable autoimmune deficiencies and illnesses. So I think that with with that privilege, how do we use it for those who aren't alive too? Because I have relatives who have died. I've had relatives who, there is so much domestic violence in Japan. I have aunties and aunties, they're evacuated. One tried to kill herself and her children, and she doesn't have that privilege. Thank you.
Can I just-
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Amazing sort of performance and talks that you gave, really insightful. One of the things I couldn't help noticing, Ashok, was that during your talk about your experience, that you became quite tearful. And I actually know what that feels like, because sometimes I get tearful when I'm giving talks, because when something really touches you, it's really deep, and can, bring you to the edge of sort of your emotions. So I was just really wondering, because we're talking about interrelational dynamics, or I can't remember the exact terminology you used. I was really interested about the dynamic of your relationship and the telling of this story from your perspective, and I suppose I'm quite interested as to the dynamic of you giving that permission to tell my story, but also I'm interested in, from your perspective, what it's like to hear that related by someone else. So it's obviously a lot of trust in this relationship, but I'm really interested in perhaps if you could both talk a little bit about the dynamic of sharing this story in this very public and quite vulnerable space.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, because it is very emotional. And of course, as I said in one part, I said, this is not mine to tell. So why am I doing it? Right? And Ayumi and I had, she's told me this story many times, and I in response to something else she was doing, I was writing this out and thinking this through, and I remember reading it to her and saying, this was just a correspondence, it's like an epistle, a letter, and I said, is this okay to read? Like, what should I do with this? And maybe it's just for her. And we had a long conversation, many conversations over it. And I would read this piece over and over to myself, because I thought, I can't read this without breaking down, right? And it's similar to being in Okinawa at that memorial. I was just like beside myself, because it's not my experience, and yet I'm witnessing something that is moving me in such a way. But what moved me, and still moves me, is in that relational space, the power and wisdom that I see coming from Ayumi, and I'm thinking, how can I act both as a listening vessel and a reflecting, someone to reflect this out into the world? Because I think that's important. That's, again, the relational. How do we, there's a bit of a danger, there is a danger in saying, okay, I shouldn't tell these certain stories, but there's also an equal danger of saying, I'm going to step back, because it's safer to not, right? I don't want to tell that story because it's not mine to tell. I'll get into trouble for it, right? As perhaps I should. But without those risks of reaching out, it's an impossibility. Now, of course, if in a conversation Amy said, you shouldn't really read this, absolutely would I not, and I would never do something like that. but I was actually surprised when Ayumi said that was actually my story, right? Because as she said, she wasn't certain she would do this. So but what I've loved about this, the relational side, and it's not just between us, but it's, I hope, between the various relationships we develop with other beings, sentient and non, is one of respect and care and compassion, knowing the experience of the other and being able to feel that emotive quality without it being one's own. You know, to cross over, to understand that is the only, I think it's the only pathway forward for us.
It's complicated. I was raised to not ask people about traumatic experiences. So there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian residential schools in Canada between 2010 and 2015. And there were national events at major cities. And so I was in a state of shock that people were on a stage, on a high platform, and they were revealing all of the horrible things that they had experienced. My mouth was like open, and I was really shocked because it's a type of entrusting to people you don't yet know. And so I remember in South Africa there was a case of, I think it was Nadine Gordimer, really famous author, South African author. And when people gave a public, so there were televised testimonies about apartheid in South Africa, it was considered public knowledge. So that it was like, there was no, like, you could use it, and you could use it for your own art practice or whatever. But so Nadine Gordimer, I believe it was her, I hope I'm not making a mistake, she kept telling this story of quite a traumatic experience that a black South African had during apartheid, woman. And it got to the point where it was circulated so much, the story, and it was beyond. So it kind of reminds me of the Minamata photograph of is it radiation? Mercury poisoning. The photograph being circulated so much that the photographer or the family said no more. So the women said no more. But I think that when we talk about trauma, I think when we talk about trauma, it hopefully in some ways creates a different collective sharing of the weight of what maybe somebody had gone through. So I didn't know about Japanese imperial colonial history, which is directly related to my own on my mother's side. But I read The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang when it came out, and I was shocked. I actually had a nervous breakdown because my grandparents had lived in China as colonizers. And my grandpa was there in Nanking. And I know he committed atrocities. I know it. So she ultimately went on to kill herself. Like, she committed suicide. And she wasn't much older than me, you know? And I remember thinking it was not for her to have to hold on to that weight of trauma by herself. So she had interviewed many people who survived, many people who were witnesses to Japanese genocide across Asia. And so sometimes I hope, and I don't know, we live in such a complex and sometimes hateful mediated reality right now, but I hope that it becomes like, you know, when there's that thing where you can pick up people with like your two fingers. If you're like, there's 8 of you and you pick people up like all at the same time. So you think it's just 2 of your fingers, but you're doing it together. And I think that's a really good kind of example of sharing the weight so that people don't have to suffer alone. And so I shared it with Ashok because I know that he shared with Ashok. And you can see with this, I love Ashok's photography. If you have a chance, please go see the show that he has put up because there's a heart in it. The interrelationality is throughout every image. And I thought if I were to tell anyone this story, it would be you. And if I give permission for anyone to share the story, it would be you.
The exhibition.
The exhibition is in D block on the first floor. So please do go and see it if you can. I think we may have time for maybe one more question. One last question before we have to leave, and then we also would like to invite you to Morpeth Arms pub, which is a kind of a tradition for TrAIN Open lectures, those who want to come, to go. Are there any final questions?
I'm going to add something before there's a question, because I realize something that's going on. I'm watching people's faces. I'm watching Ayumi's, the depth of her performance, and what I was trying to read through. What I've forgotten to mention, or neglected to mention, is that we cannot forget, and perhaps we did today, the ultimate quality of joy. And that's something that we both know and knowledge. We spend, this may not seem reflective here, we laugh a lot. Like sometimes I can't stop laughing because we're talking about the absurdity of things or the loveliness of things. And I think that's the other side, that after a session like this, of course, it's not like people are saying, yeah, that was fun, right? But there has to be joy in there too, because that is who we are as well. And I just want us to have that as a note, because it's even in the face of trauma, even in excess damage, if you cannot take this into a place of laughter, or we need that in order to heal ourselves.
And I note, Ashok, what you actually said, one of the things I noted that you said is things do not need to fall apart. So I thought it was perhaps an interesting way to end. So thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you, Ashok and Ayumi, for sharing and with us your work. We look forward to the rest of the residency and also to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.